Why would a child as young as 3 ever be on mind-altering drugs?
Well, for the past 8 months, the troubleshooters have poured through reams of state documents and discovered thousands of foster kids appear to be on powerful psychotropic or mind-altering drugs. Many of these children are barely in kindergarten. Some are even toddlers.
We didn't even know he was in the hospital until he called us from the Laurel Ridge himself.
6 years old and confined to a psychiatric hospital for a temper tantrum, a little boy calls his grandmother for help.
I mean, he was like, maybe you could say he looked more like a zombie.
How could you tell by looking at him that he was on medication?
His attitude, his eyes, his way of speech, all that.
Magdalena says a nurse confirmed her fears. Her grandchild was on 2 different psychotropic or mind-altering drugs, plus Benadryl to help him sleep. Turns out Magdalena's grandchild isn't alone. A sampling of state records released by the Comptroller's Office shows 2 out of 3 foster kids in Texas appear to be on psychotropic meds. The Medicaid prescription records are from November of last year and show that many kids are taking 2 or more of these drugs.
I have a child of 6 years old.
At the risk of losing her job, a Child Protective Services worker spoke to the troubleshooters about one child on 17 different medications. That's right, 17.
He was prescribed, I think he had like 3 to 4 psychotropic medications. In addition to the Depakote, in addition to Zoloft, in addition to Trazodone to help him sleep.
Some of these drugs, the FDA says, are not even safe for kids.
He did need medication, but I had concerns about how could this child require 17 different medications.
What's even more alarming, child advocates say, are the ages of the kids. The troubleshooters obtained a never-before-released study that tracks the ages of these foster kids on these drugs for a 1-month period of time. At least 300 of these children are under the age of 7, preschoolers, even toddlers. How big a problem are these psychotropic meds?
I think it's far larger than you or I or anybody else suspects.
Jack Downey runs the children's shelter in San Antonio. This longtime advocate for children says his heart aches when he talks about the cases.
We had a wonderful family of 5 boys. If they walked in here right now, you'd just love them to death.
The oldest was 10, the youngest 3.
We were directed by the state to take the boys to a psychiatrist. We did, and they all came back on 3 meds. And those boys no more needed meds than I did.
Every child?
Every child.
Why would a 3-year-old need to be on psychotropic meds?
I have no idea. He was just the jolliest little kid.
So who's prescribing these medications? You would think psychiatrists, right? State records show one of the biggest prescribers in San Antonio is a radiologist. Sure, it's legal, but what does a radiologist know about a child's mental health? The troubleshooters also found some of these doctors have documented drug problems of their own. Like Dr. Charles Sargent, a San Antonio psychiatrist. Dr. Sargent is on probation with the state medical board. State records show he's been busted for prescribing dangerous drugs to himself, his girlfriend, and her son. Another doctor who shows up as a frequent prescriber on state records is Dr. Benny Fernandez, the medical director at Laurel Ridge. Dr. Fernandez says his practice is primarily treating foster kids, and he says psychotropics are necessary for a lot of these kids.
I think the way we are moving now is try to use them as a last resort if you can.
When you see more than 60% in that 1-month period that was looked at on medications, do you think that medication's being used as a last resort with numbers like that?
Well, those numbers seem a little bit high.
Do you think we've got too many kids in the foster care system on medication?
Well, I wish those numbers would go down. And that's what I think we need to focus our energy and efforts in making sure that the medications, when they are used appropriately, and there's a careful diagnostic evaluation.
That's not what many of the former foster kids I spoke to say happened to them.
I was on 7 different medications at once.
Zoloft, Paxil, and Wellbutrin, and Depakote.
They put me on all kinds of meds.
And all say being on those medications made their lives more difficult.
Like a zombie.
I wasn't myself. I was more of an isolator. I stayed to myself.
And my mouth would be open and I would be drooling. And
while Texas is just beginning to deal with this controversy, We headed to a state that began tackling the issue several years ago.
Child advocates here in Florida are working to get laws passed to protect foster kids from being over-medicated. But so far, their efforts have failed. They blame the doctors and pharmaceutical companies who've lobbied against them.
We don't deal with the problems these kids have. We give them a pill.
Dr. Tony Appel, a neuropsychologist or brain specialist, was one of the expert child advocates in Florida we went to for help. We showed her the records we uncovered here in Texas.
Does it look like the kids are being treated for behavior control or being treated for mental illness?
I don't think they're treating mental illness. Not in these kids.
The psychiatrists and the people on the other side will say, well, these are sick kids. I mean, these are kids who've been sexually abused. They need medication.
Being sexually abused makes you a victim. It doesn't make you sick.
So what are we doing to these kids?
We're taking away their future. We're taking away their ability to relate to people. Trust, love, caring, the ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes and to see how they see you. We take all that away from these children.
What we've come across these last couple of days are these kids who seem to be heavily medicated. Is that common, uncommon?
We're talking about kids in the foster care system?
Yeah.
When I worked in the foster care system as a CASA, which is a court-appointed special advocate, in fact, I found that there were an alarming number of children that were being placed on psychotropic drugs. And because I was a pharmaceutical rep who had sold psychotropic drugs, I was familiar with the side effect profiles and the dangers of these products, and I was really concerned because a lot of the children were only 2, 3, 4, and 5 years old.
2 years old on...
We're talking on major antipsychotic drugs like Zyprexa, on ADHD stimulants like Adderall. Absolutely. I saw a number of children that were very small children that were placed on antipsychotic drugs. And in fact, it was often, and most often, it was off-label indications that they were being used for. In fact, antipsychotic drugs are supposed to be used for psychosis, for schizophrenia, and symptoms of that nature. And I was seeing children who had emotional disturbances that, manifested in behavioral disorders, as well as just, everyday sleep disorder or problems of a behavioral nature that they were being placed on these major antipsychotic drugs for.
So why would you prescribe those for a child?
To be honest with you, I think there's only rare circumstances that you would prescribe them for a child, primarily because children are 3 times as likely as adults to have adverse reactions to pharmacologicals. So if you're talking about a very small child who has developing kidneys and liver and brain and that sort of thing, they don't have the ability to either metabolize the drugs or to eliminate the drugs properly, and they very often become neurotoxic because they pass the blood-brain barrier.
Now, the argument made that these drugs are prescribed as part of their treatment, yes?
That's correct. But the problem with that is if you look at the long-term clinical data on these drugs, they have artificial behavioral improvements that diminish over time and completely are gone once you withdraw the drugs. So it's really only a short-term fixed situation for a behavioral issue, and many times, as I said, the drugs are contraindicated when they're given, because I've seen children that are actually manifesting symptoms from a previous stimulant drug or psychotropic drug that they've been put on, and their symptoms are actually an adverse reaction, and they're acting out, becoming aggressive and violent and psychotic, and then they're placed on antipsychotic drugs, which is in fact contraindicated, because if a child is exhibiting those types of symptoms on the other drugs, then they're neurotoxic, and that means you withdraw the drugs. You don't add additional drugs, but that's done constantly.
So what's the motivation for the pharmaceutical industry to prescribe these medications that at best seem questionable, at least in the minds of many?
Well, obviously the motivation is money, and they're extremely profitable drugs.
Oh, come on. Is it that simple? We're talking about children and who are at risk. And
I'm sorry, but we had people that were given Vioxx and were given other drugs that the pharmaceutical industry clearly knew that there were contraindications in the way they were being used and that there were risks that weren't being disclosed. That is not an unusual phenomenon in this industry.
Yo.